Now, starting off with the Leopard 2, it is what I like to call supreme German engineering. They know how to make cars, they know how to make tanks, they know how to make a lot of different things. Partially due to the fact that in the 80s, Germany decided to ignore the dot-com sort of internet stuff that America was focused on, and they went all with gear, technology, and that sort of thing. But as for the Leopard 2, it is basically a major improved version of the Leopard 1 tank. What I mean by that is they took the good aspects of the Leopard 1 and made a whole brand new tank. The Leopard 2 was introduced in 1979, and if you look at some of the Leopard 2s from around the world, you'll notice that some of them are a little bit different. This is because any version from the Leopard 2A4 and prior have more of a square-fronted turret, whereas the Leopard 2A5 and upward has more of a classy angled arrowhead sort of turret, which many may think might be better for deflections, but not necessarily true, and I'm going to get into that in this video. Now, what's very interesting about the Leopard 2 is that for Germany, when the Leopard 1 came out, they immediately knew that they already needed another new form of tank. And with that, around 1967, Germany had invested 30 million Deutschmarks into looking for a new design and upgrade. And on a side note, one of the major competitors that was a driving force for this new tank was the American and German-made MBT-70. Basically, they were like, we want to be able to match this thing or completely defeat it. And also on a side note, again, when it comes to the MBT-70, it's also a driving force for the Abrams because America really wasn't happy with that tank either. The problem with the MBT-70, it was a big tank, it was very heavy, and of course, for both sides, it cost a lot. So Germany and America were like, we need to figure out ways to make a more cost-effective tank. And although America had introduced the tank known as the XM803, these two tanks were canceled by America in 1971. And within that same year, funds were put into what was known as the M1 Abrams program, which was named after General Crichton Abrams. Now, one thing I found very fascinating about the Leopard 1 and the Abrams was the fact that because of the amount of development that had gone into both of these tanks individually, in 1973, it was because of their past work, you got NATO standardization on tanks. The reason for that was because in 1973, German and American defense ministers decided that NATO should have a standardization for the tanks using technologies that were developed already from both programs. And by 1974, both countries had signed an agreement that these two tanks should be trialed against each other. And for the Leopard 2, it was on October 25th, 1979, that the government had accepted and received its first batch of 380, to be exact, Krauss-Maffei Leopard 2 tanks. And as for the Chrysler Defense-made M1 Abrams, they came into service in 1980. Interesting enough, the original tank didn't have the 120mm gun that is on the tanks now. It had a 105mm cannon instead. But, however, with that, the M1 Abrams was the first tank in the world to use what is known as Chobham armor, which was very, very revolutionary for the time. The M1 Abrams proved to be so successful that from 1979 to 85, America had built 3,273 of these tanks. However, in 1986, they changed out the barrel to use the 120mm Rheinmetall barrel that was used very similarly on the Leopard 2. So now that we got a little bit of the history behind them, it's really quite interesting that they were both kind of brought up together. Whatever your thoughts on which one is better, I always like to think of the Leopard 2 and the Abrams kind of as brothers being raised in the same house. However, with that, let's get into variants. Let's talk about different things that are offered between different types. And of course, I'm not going to list off every single one because for the Leopard 2, it has at least 14 different versions that are currently out or are currently in production. One of the variants that is very unique compared to the rest of them that I really want to mention, and I did mention prior, is the Stridsvagn 122 or the Leopard 2S that Sweden makes. But however, one of the biggest changes was when the Leopard 2 came out with the Leopard 2A4. For this variant, there were major overhauls. They introduced an automated fire and explosion suppression system. There were also many upgrades that were taken from the 2A3. There was also a titanium tungsten armor upgrade. And basically from that moment on, the Leopard 2A4 became standard, and every vehicle prior became upgraded to that version. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of Leopard 2A4s that are around today simply because in the year 2000, Germany and the Netherlands had a lot of these in storage doing nothing, and they decided, you know what, we got to sell these to other countries. However, I'm going to talk about operational history a little bit later. because shortly after the 2A4 was introduced, they upgraded to the new 2A5, which got a major new look and design with the wedge arrowhead shape look. There were also new liners put inside the craft to prevent fragments from penetrating. Now, this new wedge-shaped design, a lot of people think, oh, it's, made for more deflections. That's not necessarily true. The original base shape of the armor on the Leopard 2A4 is capable of deflecting quite well. The 2A5, I like to describe more or less as kind of a pillow or a cushion for incoming shots. Basically, it prevents incoming fire from hitting the armor base and causes the kinetic penetrators to change in direction or simply erode. There's a lot of science behind this whole thing, but from my understanding, the wedge shape is not made to make it go pew and deflect. After that, there was the introduction of the 2A6, which has enhanced mine protection and crew survivability enhancements. There were also many other upgrades that were pretty much considered now the standard. And of course, there's countries like Canada that have done major modifications to the 2A6 to make it their own. Also, the Stridsvagn 2S, going back to that, it's considered one of the most armored versions of a Leopard 2. There's also the Leopard 2A7 and the A7 Plus, which recently Qatar and Hungary have been considered the largest buyers of this variant. The M1A1, however, has 28 different versions. However, keep in mind there are 7 major ones, but only 3 of those are realistically practical use, where the other ones are more experimental. And those 3 are the M1, the M1A1, and the M1A2. For example, under the M1A1, it has 10 versions alone, including the original. The M1A2 has 7, including its original as well, in which some of them are still under development. For the M1A1, however, there were many different upgrades, but one of the biggest one was the barrel that I was talking about. This one began production in 1985, and that's when they added the 120 smoothbore cannon. On top of that, they also upgraded the NBC system, improved stowage, and of course, redesigned the blow-off panels. However, the M1A2, which is more or less the common one that we see today, it brought in an independent thermal sight for the tank commanders, meaning that it could shoot at 2 targets at once without the need to acquire one individually. Do not ask me how that works. That seems like you have 2 eyes looking in 2 different directions. It also added the very updated and extraordinarily tough depleted uranium armor components, which also have graphite coating on them. They also improved the counter-IED armor, improved on the FLIR abilities, added passive ballistic protection to some other versions on the M1A2's turret, and of course there were much more. It's quite an impressive list. As for one of the newer ones, which is the M1A3, it is considered still in development and there's not a lot of information about it. Alright, so now that we got variants out of the way, let's look at the operational history. For the Leopard 2 tank, it is operated within 18 different countries. These are the countries of Austria, Canada, Chile, Denmark, Finland, Germany, of course, Greece, Indonesia, the Netherlands, which that one is a little bit tricky to understand because they've gotten rid of a lot of their tanks, but they do have a division that's linked with a German unit, so that's kind of how it works. There's also Norway, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, Singapore, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland. Switzerland also don't really have any of them. They've put most of them in storage from my understanding. They're going more for wheeled, tracked kind of vehicles. And last but not least, let's not forget the country of Turkey. For the M1 Abrams, it is operated in far less countries, equaling 7. These are the countries of Australia, Egypt, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and of course the United States of America. However, when it comes to the amount of these tanks being built, let's be real, there's far more Abrams around the world than there are Leopard 2s. Although it is hard to get an accurate figure of how many of these have been made, for the Leopard 2 they say there is greater than 3,200 of them been made, and for the M1 Abrams they say there's approximately 10,288. Alright, let's move right along and let's look at some of the statistics. Now, the Leopard 2 for armor has what is known as 3rd generation composite, including high hardness steel, tungsten, and plastic filler with ceramic components. The M1A2, however, uses what is known as depleted uranium mesh reinforced composite armor. As for armaments, the Leopard 2 uses the 1x120mm smoothbore Rhine metal with approximately 42 rounds. On top of that, it has a 2x7.62 German-made MG3 with approximately 4,750 rounds. The M1A2, however, also uses the 120mm smoothbore Rheinmetall gun with 42 rounds as well. And with machine guns, they have the exact same amount, 2 times of them, using the same caliber that is 7.62. However, they use the M240. One major upside of the M1A1, it has more machine gun rounds coming in at 10,400. Speed, however, the Leopard 2 is a little bit faster, but not by much. This is because the Leopard 2 comes in at 68 kilometers per hour at its best, and the M1A2 comes in at 67 kilometers per hour. Keep in mind that is on-road, that is not off-road, doing anything crazy like that. It is much slower. Of course, also with the operational range, it is far less for the Leopard 2, coming in at 340 kilometers, whereas the Leopard M1A2 with its gas tanks can come in at 436 kilometers. And for some of the technical statistics, for the Leopard 2A6, it is manned by a crew of 4. It has a length of 10.97 meters, with a width of 3.76 meters and a height of 3.03 meters. Its combat weight comes in at 62.5 tons, and its turret rotation of 360 degrees can be done in 9 to 10 seconds. Looking now at the M1A2 SEP version of the Abrams, it is crewed with 4 individuals. It also has a length of 9.77 meters, being a little bit smaller. It's also a bit smaller in width, coming in at 3.7 meters, and much smaller in its height at 2.4 meters. Its combat weight is a little bit heavier at 63 tons, and for its turret rotation 360 degrees, it is said to be anywhere between 9 to 10 seconds as well. See what I mean by they're kind of like brothers? They kind of are capable of doing the same thing. It's kind of interesting. And to finish it all off, when it comes to cost, for a Leopard 2A6 in 2007, it came in at $5.74 million, where an M1A2, at least in 1999, came in at $6.21 million US dollars. We look at 2 pretty unique tanks. The M1 Abrams, which is pretty much seen in every single Michael Bay movie, and is on the front line of every heavy American assault. And we put it up against France's Leclerc tank and find out what the differences are. So let's begin looking at the Leclerc. Now, this was a major contender for many countries in its early development. It's been in service since 1993, but it's had a rather long development phase that began as far back as 1983, although some say it goes far as back as 1978. The Leclerc tank, however, was made to be a replacement for the AMX-30 battle tank. Now, this was a tank that entered service in 1960, and what some people don't know is that shortly before the Leclerc began production in 1980, France was working on a co-development deal with West Germany to build a tank. However, unfortunately, this fell through when France was like, nah, you know what? We want to go solo. We want to make our own tank. Rightfully so. Go France. One of the big problems, though, that the old AMX-30 had compared to its previous tanks was that it was lighter simply because the speed was a major key rather than armor during those times. But with the introduction of armor-piercing rounds and composite armor, it opened up a lot of new challenges for tank designers in the 70s. And as a matter of fact, did you know that when the Leclerc first rolled out, it was one of the most expensive tanks ever in the entire world? Now, obviously, that's changed over time, and I'll explain that as we go through the video. But before we do that, to give you an idea of how much it cost back then, in today's world, it would equate to roughly over $9 million, which is about $2 million more than an Abrams, and about 2 times more than your average T90. And as the year 1990 began, this tank had gone through trials, and it was the new tank for France. The M1 Abrams is also a very remarkable piece of machinery. Heck, it's been proven for many years. She began service in 1980, and she was the replacement for the good old-fashioned M60 Patton. Major development for this vehicle began when funds were given to the XM1 program in 1971 instead of 2 other tank programs. Now, what made this tank very unique compared to other tanks is it introduced Chobham armor, which is a very, very reinforced version of steel. It's tough. Which meant that old school steel would no longer be effective at all, and in today's world, if you were to use it, an anti-tank round would go through that steel like a blowtorch through butter. Interesting enough, though, that the French actually also refused the use of this armor on the Leclerc because they wanted to instead develop their own type of composite armor, which doesn't have a lot of details on it, unfortunately. Now, the Leclerc battle tank is made by the Nexter company. Originally, however, it was developed by GIAT, which eventually became Nexter. Side note, with GIAT, they had a really hard time in sales until the Leclerc proved to be a good battle tank. And even with the good sales, the Leclerc is only actually used by 2 countries, and that is the countries of France and the good old United Arab Emirates. As a matter of fact, both of these countries are very well balanced in the amount of tanks that they have. France has about 406 of these, plus 20 that are classified as recovery vehicles, where the UAE has 388 Leclerc tanks. However, 46 of them are classified as armored recovery vehicles as well. In total, there is approximately 862 of these Leclerc tanks that have been made in today's world, and it is unfortunate that not many other countries have had a major interest in it over the years. However, there have been a few countries like Qatar and Colombia that have shown interest, but nothing is official so far. The M1 Abrams, though, it is way different. They've got a lot of them. I mean, a lot. There is about 10,288 of these bad boys made, originally designed by Chrysler Defense, which is now General Dynamics Land Systems. A lot of them were built in the Lima tank plant in Lima, Ohio, and the very famous Detroit Arsenal tank plant in Warren, Michigan. This is actually a very cool and very important tank plant, just so you guys know. This is because it was the first major tank factory within the United States. Now, for operators, the M1 Abrams is in Australia, Egypt, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and yes, good old USA, which has actually most of them coming in at over 6,000. The countries of Greece, Peru, and Taiwan have also had interest in this tank, but however, they are waiting the US approval for some of these. Variants, probably one of my favorite things to talk about because there's just a lot of different cool little things that they've added to different types of tanks. The Leclerc, you've got Series 1, which I sometimes call the Original. The Series 2 had some major upgrades in 2009. New thermal optics were added. The nuclear, biological, and chemical system added air conditioning, very nice. Frontal armor was also thickened as well on the turret. There was also the newer 221 series, which they had a lot of upgrades to the armor. For example, more titanium besides tungsten. On top of that, within the 221 series, there was also a new thermal viewfinder that was added with a laser range finder and a few other cool features, including targeting features like IFF. On top of that, there were other individual variants such as the Flak Panzer, which is basically your anti-aircraft variant. A couple of recovery tank versions were also made. The type of tank that the UAE has been modified to what they call tropicalized. It's got some specific gear that the government of the UAE wanted that they prefer. An example of this is a tank infantry phone and a different power pack, that sort of thing. There's also been a few proposed and canceled prototypes. The new Leclerc XLR is your newest version, set to come out in 2020, and it's said to have Scorpion-type camouflage, or so they say. Overall, however, the Leclerc has about 13 different variants, either in use or currently or were proposed at one point and are now canceled. The M1 Abrams, though, oh my god, it's got a lot of variants. I mean, it's a lot. Starting off, you have your basic M1, there's also the M1A1, the M1A2, and the M1A3 as the main variants. The M1A3 is the newest one in development. However, within these top variants, you also have sub-variants, which I'll include in the total shortly. Should actually be mentioned that the first M1 Abrams that came out, it actually didn't have the same type of barrel that it uses now. It used a 105mm barrel. This, of course, was changed for the M1A1 version, which it adapted the smoothbore barrel from the Leopard 2. The M1A2 has a more advanced and updated armor using second-generation version of the depleted uranium armor. Also, side note, depleted uranium armor was added on the M1A1 for the first time. And just so you know, depleted uranium armor is about 1.7 times more dense than steel, so it's very, very strong. The M1A2 basically had a uniform upgrade with this armor, and all M1A1s are now upgraded to this version. There, of course, were some prototypes for unmanned versions of this tank. Also ones with a bigger barrel using 140 millimeters. Interesting enough though, the M1 Abrams never had an anti-air version ever made. This is probably due to the fact that America just simply didn't need this. They have a really good air superiority system, and by that I mean they have a lot of friggin' fighters. A lot. There was also bridge-making versions, breacher versions. However, there was no recovery version that was ever made and put into service, but there was at least one prototype made. In total, you have 32 versions at least of the M1 Abrams. I should also mention that the M1A2C, which is theoretically the SEP version 3, which stands for System Enhancement Package, is generally the most upgraded version, using 3rd generation depleted uranium armor and a lot of other bells and whistles. This particular tank began field testing in 2017 and it's set for field work in 2020. Specifications. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Did you know that the Abrams has 4 crew members, or it needs 4 crew members, whereas the Leclerc only has 3. Why is that? One major different factor is that the Leclerc was one of the only few westernized tanks to feature an auto loader, where the M1 Abrams was made to have a human load the shell. And speaking of guns, both the Leclerc and the Abrams use the 120 smoothbore gun. The Leclerc has about 40 rounds within it, whereas the Abrams has 42. The auto loader can make the Leclerc fire 12 rounds per minute, where a good loader in the Abrams can shoot at rumored about 15 rounds per minute. But of course, that is a very experienced person loading this particular type of tank. And let's be perfectly honest, rate of fire does not always matter when it comes to tanks. This is because the thing that really does count is what type of ammunition you're using, what type of shell you're using, and of course, how fast you can hit your target for the first time. I also want to mention when we look at these specifications, I'm looking at the generally more advanced versions of these tanks. For example, the Leclerc, I'm looking at the XX1, and for the M1 Abrams, I'm looking at the M1A2 SEP. And with that, when it comes to guns, the Abrams has 3 of them. It has 2 7.62 machine guns plus a 12.7 millimeter gun, whereas the Leclerc only has 2 machine guns. One is a 7.62 and the other is a 12.7 millimeter. Weight, however, the Leclerc is one of the lightest tanks in the modern world, coming in at 54 tons, whereas the Abrams is 63. In terms of length of hull, not including barrel, the Leclerc is smaller, coming in at 6.88 meters. The M1 Abrams is 7.92 meters. Width, however, the Leclerc is a little fatter at 3.71 meters, where the M1 Abrams is 3.7 meters. Height, however, the M1 Abrams was meant to be a very low-profile tank. With that, it comes in at 2.4 meters, and the Leclerc is slightly taller at 2.92 meters. Speed, of course, this is a heavily argued thing, but when it comes to the M1 Abrams, it's said it can go up to 68 kilometers per hour. With that, it has an effective range of approximately 625 kilometers. The Leclerc, however, can go up to 71 kilometers per hour, but has a range of only 550 kilometers. Now, as for price, I did say I would get into it. Remember how I said the Leclerc was one of the most expensive tanks at the time? Well, now it's not really. This is because the Leclerc in 2016 came at approximately a little over $4 million US, whereas the Abrams came in at $8.92 million for one tank. Keep in mind, that is all in US dollars. We continue to learn more about the Stridsvagn 122 and find out the differences between it and the Leopard 2 tank which it's built around. So the Stridsvagn 122 is basically your Swedish version of the Leopard 2. Sometimes people actually refer to this as the Leopard 2S, as a matter of fact. It's also considered the most armored version of a Leopard 2 of any other variant in the entire world. And for this video, we're going to look at the differences between this and the Leopard 2A5, which is the more advanced version of the Leopard 2 tanks. Bit of a backstory, the Leopard 2 was originally brought into service in Germany in 1979, and for the Leopard 2S, it wasn't brought in until about 1997, when Sweden wanted a modified version of the tank for its style of fighting, which was mostly forested locations and urban combat. As for the Leopard 2A5, this was another version with heavy upgrades, and it was introduced into Germany in 1995. This particular version introduced the wedge-shaped frontal armor that you see on most Leopard 2s nowadays.
And that's somewhat the same armor that the Leopard 2S has. It just has a little bit more, and I'm going to get into that. Because what makes these two different? Well, let's take a look. Firstly, when it comes to cost, the Stridsvagn 122 comes in at approximately 5.74 million US dollars, where the Leopard 2A5 is a little bit more with 6.86 million US dollars. And although the weight is slightly different compared to the two, the length and the width comes in generally the same, both having a length of 9.97 meters and a width of 3.75 meters. As for the height, they both equal 3 meters for both versions. For the 122s, though, they are a little bit heavier, coming in at 62.5 tons, whereas the Leopard 2A5 is a little bit under at 62.3 tons. Why is there a major difference between the weight? Well, it's basically armor. Both tanks use what is known as third-generation composite armor, but the Stridsvagn has some major upgrades in different places. For example, it's added increased armor at the top of the turret and the front hull, with about 3 tons worth being added. As well, on top of that, when it comes to the crew hatches, they are considered to be much thicker. Now, for armaments, these two tanks use the same. Both the Leopard 2A5 and the Stridsvagn 122 use the 120mm smoothbore gun, both having 42 rounds. For the machine guns, they are both 7.62 in size and generally have around the same amount of ammunition. The power and weight, however, is different for the Stridsvagn 122 simply because it is slightly heavier, making it have 24 horsepower per ton, whereas the Leopard 2A5 has 24.08 horsepower per ton. Range is the same, coming in at around 550 kilometers, with the same amount of fuel within the tank coming in at 1,200 liters. Now, speed, however, this is where things get a little bit tricky. Now, I've heard that the Stridsvagn 122 is a little bit slower, coming in at 68 kilometers per hour, whereas the Leopard 2A5 can go about 4 kilometers faster at 72 kilometers per hour. However, some reports have also stated that the Stridsvagn is capable of going up to 72, but many other reports counter that, so not entirely sure on that one. But one of the most important features when it comes to the Stridsvagn 122 is the side smoke dispensers. That's how you can really tell the difference between a Leopard 2A5 and a Stridsvagn 122. This is because on the side, for protection, the Stridsvagn uses what is known as the French Galax smoke dispensers. It also has been upgraded with a new fire control system and Swedish radio, and among a few other things. Both of them are capable of doing very similar things and are quite reliable to the people that use them.